She kissed her mom goodnight, said she was just going to a friend's house, and never came back. January 1996, Auburn, Washington. 16-year-old Rowan Hale's body was found in a snowy alley, stabbed more than 9 times. The killer left no weapon, no motive, no trace, only terror. For nearly 20 years, the case froze in silence, until advanced DNA pulled a name straight out of the shadows, a name the town had feared all along. This is not just a story, it's a warning. Subscribe now, follow for more untold crimes, and hit the bell. Because the truth always comes out, even after decades. January 1996, Auburn, Washington. The kind of town people imagine when they think of the American Northwest in winter. Gray skies pressing low, breath visible on the air, lawns etched with frost. In the evenings, streetlights flickered on before most families finished dinner. Kids dragged their boots through slushy snowbanks. The scent of chimney smoke drifted between rows of modest houses, and the world felt still except for the distant hum of cars on Main Street. For Rowan Hale, 16 years old, and always a little apart from the crowd, this was home. Her room overlooked the backyard, where she'd spent summers sketching wildflowers in her notebook, hoping her parents wouldn't call her in for chores. She was quiet, even at school. Her voice rarely rose above a murmur. But in her art, she was bold, painting swirling night skies and the fever-bright oranges of imagined sunsets. Rowan dreamed of college, maybe even art school out in Seattle, though she'd only told her best friend Lydia about that hope. It felt too delicate, too private, to share with anyone else. That particular January evening began like 100 others. Rowan sitting at the kitchen table, pencil tucked behind her ear, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of cocoa, while her mom, Marjorie, busied herself at the stove. The air was thick with the scent of tomato soup and something sweet baking for dessert. Her father, Caleb, shuffled through the mail, reading bills with a tired kind of sigh he tried to hide from Rowan. "Don't forget you promised to help me with the attic this weekend," he called over, not looking up. Rowan just smiled. She was used to his reminders, used to her mother's gentle hovering and the rhythms of their small, warm house. But that night, she was restless, an itch beneath her skin to be out, to breathe the cold air, to feel the crunch of snow under her sneakers. She told her parents she was heading just a few blocks over, to Lydia's house to study for their upcoming history test. Lydia's house was a safe, ordinary place. They'd done it dozens of times, walked together, heads bent against the wind, complaining about assignments and planning summer adventures. But this evening, as she bundled into her coat, Rowan felt a ripple of anticipation. Maybe it was the clear air, or the silence of the streets, or just the sense that she was stepping into something bigger than her daily routine. She didn't know and wouldn't have been able to put words to it if she tried. She kissed her mother on the cheek, promised to be home by 9, and slipped into the twilight. The world outside was a patchwork of shadows and golden rectangles where windows glowed. Rowan's breath came out in sharp white bursts. The snow, still soft from a midday flurry, muffled the sound of her steps as she passed Mr. Bradley's house. He always left his porch light on, even when he wasn't home. The little church at the end of the block, the park where she'd played as a child. She thought about her art class, about the new paints she'd saved up for, the unfinished canvas on her desk, the way her teacher had said, "You see things differently, Rowan. Don't be afraid of that." Those words looped in her mind, a private melody as she made her way past the shuttered storefronts and darkened yards. A few blocks away, Lydia's house shone with warmth. Rowan pictured Lydia's mom bustling around, her little brother sprawled on the living room carpet. But Rowan was early, and she had time. She decided, impulsively, to take a shortcut. A narrow alley she'd walked 100 times in daylight. But tonight, it looked different. The alley was lined with sagging wooden fences, and the dull yellow haze of streetlights reflected off the icy ground. Shadows pooled between the garbage bins, and Rowan felt a flicker of unease. Still, she pressed on, thinking of the promise she'd made to herself at the start of the year. Be braver. Say yes. Take small risks. She didn't know that, at that same moment, her mother was clearing the table and humming to herself, Caleb dozing in his chair, the house safe and ordinary. Rowan's absence wouldn't be noticed for hours. She didn't know that halfway across town, a battered green pickup idled near a corner, its engine ticking softly in the cold. She couldn't know about the eyes watching from the gloom, the shape that shifted just out of sight as she stepped further from the safety of Main Street. But in that moment, Rowan felt free. She kicked at a clump of snow, made a mental note to text Lydia when she reached the end of the alley. She was thinking about college, about the painting she'd finish when she got home, about the taste of her mom's chocolate cake. The town around her was hushed, waiting, as if holding its breath. That was the last time anyone saw Rowan Hale alive. The next hours would unfold slowly, at first. A phone call not answered. A worried parent pacing the living room. The creeping realization that something was wrong. But all of that was still ahead. For now, in the cold, silent dark, Rowan disappeared into the night, and an unfinished promise trailed behind her, fragile as frost. The world outside was caught between dusk and true night. Auburn's narrow streets, usually quiet after sunset, had become nearly deserted in the frigid air. Every breath Rowan exhaled crystallized in front of her, drifting away before she could notice. She drew her coat tighter and kept her head down, letting the familiar crunch of ice beneath her sneakers set the rhythm of her steps. She reached the entrance to the shortcut, an alley sandwiched between two sagging clapboard fences, the paint peeling away in long, sad strips. The alley was the kind of place parents warned kids about, but everyone used it anyway, trusting routine and small-town safety. A single street lamp stood halfway down, its bulb humming, casting a puddle of weak yellow light that did nothing to chase away the deeper shadows. Trash cans leaned at awkward angles. The snow heaped up against them, hiding the usual litter of bottles and wrappers. Rowan paused for just a second. Her breath caught as a sudden gust rattled a loose sheet of metal, making a sharp clang echo off the fences. She glanced over her shoulder. Just instinct, nothing more. But the street behind her was empty. Windows shuttered against the cold. The only sound was the faint hum of distant traffic and the hush of her own heartbeat. She reminded herself of the promise she'd made to be braver this year. The alley was just a shortcut, not a danger. She stepped forward, her shoes slipping a little on the slick, trampled snow. The light overhead flickered as she passed beneath it, turning her shadow into a thin, stretched silhouette on the uneven ground. A few steps in, the sounds of the main street faded completely. All that was left was the shuffle of her shoes, the tick of her watch, and the soft creak of branches rubbing together in the wind. Rowan focused on the opposite end of the alley. A faint glow where it met the next street, a beacon promising safety and warmth. She quickened her pace not out of fear, but a restless urge to get through the tunnel of shadow and into the light. She never saw the shape waiting for her, someone standing perfectly still in the dark, blending with the broken fence and the piles of snow. The attack came swift and silent, a sudden pressure behind her, then a sharp, burning pain that stole her breath. Rowan staggered, trying to turn, but another blow landed, then another, each one slicing through the numbing cold and into her back. She gasped, a thin cry ripped away by the wind. Panic bloomed in her chest. Her hands scrabbled at the air, at her coat, at the attacker who was nothing but shadow and force and hatred. Blood, impossibly warm, spilled from the wounds, soaking through her sweater, staining the snow beneath her feet, a deep, glistening red. The alley swallowed her struggles. Somewhere, far off, a dog barked. A porch light flickered on in the distance, then off again. Rowan tried to scream, but the pain stole her voice. Her legs buckled, and she collapsed onto the icy ground. The world tilted, the street lamp spinning overhead, the light blurring with her tears. The attacker retreated, boots crunching away into the darkness, leaving Rowan alone with the rising cold and the growing pool of blood. Her thoughts scattered like frightened birds. Lydia, her mother's chocolate cake, the unfinished painting on her desk. These things flashed through her mind, half-formed and distant. Her fingers twitched, reaching out for help that would not come in time. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds. The snow muffled everything, her breathing, the sounds of footsteps disappearing, the world itself. Rowan's body grew heavy, as if the earth was pulling her down, away from the sharpness of pain and the terror that clung to her. She closed her eyes, the alley spinning away, the cold numbing her to everything but the ache of loss. She was 16, and the world was slipping out of reach. It was later, a neighbor on his way home from work would remember this moment for years, when the horror was first discovered. He cut through the alley, as he had every night for months, hoping to get home a little quicker, dinner waiting for him. He spotted the shape in the snow, an unnatural mound at the edge of the lamp's sickly glow. For a moment, he thought it was just a pile of discarded clothes, the kind kids sometimes dumped in the alley after a snowball fight. But as he drew closer, the truth became clear. The bright crimson pooling around the motionless form, the strange way her hair fanned out across the snow, her backpack flung open, its contents scattered, textbooks, colored pencils, a folded note labeled Lydia. He stumbled back, heart racing, his voice cracking the silence as he shouted for help. Lights flickered on in the nearby houses. Someone called 911. Sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder and louder, slicing through the night. But Rowan Hale would not hear them. Her unfinished promise faded into the winter dark, leaving Auburn forever changed. And as the first responders arrived, breathless and urgent, the alley became a crime scene, a place where innocence had been shattered, and the questions would outlast the falling snow. News travels fast in a small town, but tragedy travels even faster. By dawn, the story had already shifted from rumor to horrifying reality. Police tape fluttered in the frigid wind, cordoning off the alley as uniformed officers moved quietly, eyes fixed on the frozen ground. The world Rowan Hale had known, the safe, predictable rhythms of Auburn, fractured in a single, irreversible night. It began with sirens. The distant wail grew until it filled every bedroom and kitchen on the block. Neighbors stood in windows, faces pale, clutching their bathrobes. Some thought there had been an accident, maybe a drunk driver sliding on ice, maybe a burst water main. Few were prepared for what actually unfolded beneath the yellow glow of the street lamp. By the time the coroner's van pulled away, a hush had settled over the neighborhood, broken only by the low voices of detectives and the mechanical click of cameras capturing every inch of blood-spattered snow. Rowan's backpack lay where it had fallen, her textbooks soaked and curling at the edges. An officer gingerly placed her colored pencils into an evidence bag, as if afraid to break the spell of sadness that hung over the scene. As the sun rose, the news broke across town. 16-year-old girl murdered while walking to a friend's house. The words felt impossible, like a line from some other place, some other family. But it was real, and it was Auburn's heartbreak now. At Auburn High School, classes were canceled before noon. Students gathered in the hallways, faces drawn, voices barely above a whisper. The teachers, stunned and hollow-eyed, could barely meet their students' gazes. No one quite knew what to do. Some kids clung to each other and wept. Others sat in silence, scrolling through messages, reading the same sparse details over and over. A shortcut, an alley, a promising life ended for no reason at all. By mid-afternoon, the alley was transformed. Where there had been nothing but snow and silence the night before, now there was a trembling crowd. Friends, teachers, neighbors, people who'd never spoken to Rowan, but who felt the sting of her loss just as sharply. They came with flowers, scarves, and flickering candles. One girl hung a watercolor painting, a swirl of purple and gold, Rowan's favorite colors, on the splintered fence. A teacher stood with a box of tissues, quietly passing them to anyone who needed comfort. Lydia, Rowan's best friend, sat on the curb, arms wrapped tight around her knees, her face hidden beneath her tangled hair. In the center of it all were Caleb and Marjorie Hale, shoulders bowed as if crushed by invisible weights. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Grief radiated from them, raw and uncontainable, a silent plea for answers. Marjorie clutched a photograph of Rowan in her art smock, beaming at the camera, paint on her nose. Caleb gripped her hand so tightly, his knuckles blanched white, as if by holding on he could keep their daughter from slipping any further away. Reporters arrived, their faces apologetic as they pointed cameras and scribbled notes. A detective, eyes rimmed red with exhaustion, stepped forward to address the crowd. "We're launching a full investigation. Anyone who saw or heard anything, please come forward. We won't rest until we find who did this." His voice was steady, but his hands shook as he spoke. Operation Lantern, they called it. Dozens of officers swept the area, knocking on every door, canvassing for witnesses. The sound of police radios crackled through the neighborhoods. By the end of the first day, hundreds of statements had been gathered, people recalling every odd noise, every stranger seen, every car that lingered too long on a side street. Auburn's sense of safety, once as constant as the winter rain, evaporated. The town changed, almost overnight. Parents no longer let their children walk alone, even in daylight. Doors that had once been left unlocked were now bolted and checked twice. At the high school, the art room became a makeshift memorial, sketches and letters pinned to the wall beneath Rowan's last painting. The school counselor's office was always full, a line of students waiting for someone to help them understand how something so terrible could happen to someone so gentle. Days blurred together. The pain in Rowan's absence was everywhere, in the silent halls of her home, in the empty desk at the back of the art room, in the way the sun seemed just a little dimmer. But even as fear and sorrow pressed in, something else took root. A fierce determination. The Hales stood in front of the news cameras, voices cracking with tears, pleading for justice. "Rowan was our heart," Caleb said, staring straight into the lens. "And whoever did this, please just come forward. Let us have peace." Marjorie could only whisper, her words nearly swallowed by the cold. "Please help us." Auburn was not a place that let go easily. As night fell and the crowd at the alley thinned, candles kept burning, their flames wavering in the winter wind, casting long, stubborn shadows across the snow. The investigation had begun, but the wound in the town was fresh and deep. Rowan's promise was unfinished, her absence a silent challenge to everyone left behind. Find the truth, no matter what it takes. The first days after Rowan's death felt as if time had thickened, every second dragging with the weight of unanswered questions. Police worked round the clock, the hum of their patrol cars and the bark of police dogs echoing down Auburn's frozen side streets. Their presence became a fixture: yellow tape and blue uniforms, clusters of officers with grim faces searching for the thread that would unravel the truth. In the alley, the snow bore scars of the past days, muddy footprints from investigators, tape marks from where evidence had been gathered, melted patches where candles burned in vigil. The scent of wax and sorrow still lingered. Officers returned to the scene again and again, each visit stripping away another layer of innocence from that narrow passageway. It no longer looked like a shortcut, but like a scar running through the heart of the town. The first clue, if it could be called that, came from the coroner's office. The autopsy was coldly precise. Rowan had been stabbed more than 9 times, most of the wounds clustered in her back. The violence of it stunned even the seasoned pathologist. There were no defensive wounds, nothing to suggest Rowan had time to fight back, just one small bruise on her wrist, where she may have tried to twist away in the final moments. There were no signs of sexual assault, no jewelry missing. Her wallet still in her backpack, untouched. Whatever had happened, it was swift and deliberate, over before help could arrive. The murder weapon, a knife certainly, with a long, thin blade, had vanished without a trace. Teams combed the alley, the adjacent yards, the storm drains, even the shallow creek that cut through the neighborhood park. All they found was a single torn button from Rowan's coat and the fading splash of her blood, already freezing into the crust of the January snow. In the days that followed, Auburn police launched the largest investigation the town had ever seen. Operation Lantern expanded to cover every possible lead. They went door to door, interviewing neighbors who shivered on porches and tried to recall anything unusual: a strange car, a sudden noise, a hurried figure. Some remembered seeing a shape moving near the alley, but darkness and fear blurred the details. The composite sketches they produced looked more like ghosts than suspects. Detectives studied traffic camera footage from the main street, but the grainy images showed little more than headlights sweeping by, snow falling steadily, and the briefest flicker of someone in a hooded coat. It was a clue, but not enough. No one recognized the figure, and the resolution was too poor for any positive identification. They asked the community for tips. Calls flooded the police station, some helpful, most fueled by panic. One woman thought she'd seen a man loitering near the convenience store. A jogger swore he'd heard a scream 2 blocks away, but the time didn't match. Every lead was followed, every shadow chased, but nothing brought the detectives any closer. The forensic teams worked tirelessly, bagging every scrap of possible evidence from the alley and Rowan's clothing. Swabs, hair samples, footprints, every item cataloged and sent to the lab. But as the days ticked by, the reports trickled back with a chilling sameness. No DNA match. Nothing from the national databases. Nothing to tie anyone to the alley or to Rowan, except for the tiny traces of her own blood and the persistent echo of violence. Tension rose with every day the case remained unsolved. Reporters camped outside the police station. Any suspects? Any progress? The chief of police, a man not accustomed to being in the public eye, gave the same answers again and again. We are pursuing all leads. This investigation is our highest priority. Please, anyone with information, come forward. Inside their home, the Hales waited in silent agony. Caleb stared for hours at the family phone, willing it to ring with good news. Marjorie drifted from room to room, dusting Rowan's desk, straightening her paints and brushes, folding the same blanket over and over. The emptiness pressed in, heavy and suffocating. In the community, fear soured into frustration. Parents began to wonder aloud if the killer was one of their own, someone they passed every day in the grocery store or nodded to at church. Trust, once abundant, turned brittle. Strangers received wary glances. Kids were ushered straight home after school, and the shortcut alley became a place no one would go, even in broad daylight. Weeks stretched into months, and the case that had dominated every conversation began to fade into the background noise of daily life. The investigation remained open, every officer haunted by Rowan's gentle smile, her unfinished promise. Yet with every dead end, hope flickered and waned. Operation Lantern's files grew thicker. Statements, photographs, evidence logs, maps of the neighborhood covered in pushpins and marker lines. But at the bottom of every page was the same emptiness that lingered in the alley. The killer had vanished, and with each passing day, the possibility of closure seemed further away. Rowan's art still hung in the high school's main hallway, a reminder of what had been lost. And in the small, cold hours of the morning, Caleb and Marjorie Hale whispered silent prayers for answers, not ready to let go, but already beginning to fear that their daughter's story would end not with justice, but with silence. As the weeks slipped by and winter clung stubbornly to Auburn, the investigation into Rowan Hale's murder entered a restless, uneasy phase. The early frenzy of activity had settled into something grimmer, a methodical, day-by-day grind of interviews, cross-checks, and mounting community tension. For every lead that fizzled, hope dimmed a little more, yet the detectives refused to give in. One detail, seemingly small at first, began to stand out among the witness statements. Several people recalled a green pickup truck lingering near the alley around the time Rowan vanished. One neighbor saw it idling just past the intersection, its headlights off, engine rumbling faintly in the cold. Another remembered seeing it again a few blocks away, pausing as if waiting for something, or someone. It was an old model, battered and faded, with a cracked windshield and a dent in the rear fender. In a town where most people recognized each other's cars, this one was suddenly suspicious. Detectives traced every registered green pickup in Auburn and the neighboring towns. Most were easily accounted for: delivery trucks, handyman vehicles, the occasional farm rig. But one name kept surfacing: Damon Kincaid. At 24, Damon was already known to the police, a fact that unsettled everyone. He worked nights delivering milk for a local dairy and lived alone in a run-down trailer on the edge of town. Rumors about him circulated in whispers: violent outbursts at bars, a reputation for carrying a knife, a handful of previous arrests that never quite stuck. Damon was brought in for questioning within days of the sighting. The first time he was sullen and dismissive, denying he'd been near the alley or even in town that night. Detectives noted the scars on his knuckles, the flicker of anger in his eyes when pressed for details. He said he'd spent the evening at home, alone, fixing his truck. No one could confirm his story, but neither could anyone prove it false. His alibi was as thin as the ice still clinging to the edges of the river. The police searched Damon's trailer and his truck, looking for any trace of blood, fibers, or a weapon. They combed through his laundry, peeled back the floor mats, pried open toolboxes, but nothing connected him to Rowan. The knife he carried was clean. The pickup yielded only cigarette butts and a worn cassette tape. Forensics ran the tests twice, desperate for a break, but came up empty-handed every time. Word of Damon's history soon leaked beyond the investigation. He'd been suspected in a bar fight the year before, and there were whispers of a knife attack on a former girlfriend, a case that never went to court for lack of evidence. Some townspeople believed that wherever violence broke out, Damon wasn't far away. But rumors, even ugly ones, were not enough for an arrest. Detectives interviewed Damon again and again. He maintained his innocence, sometimes angry, sometimes eerily calm. Each time, the officers hoped he would slip up, contradict himself, or show a flicker of guilt. Instead, Damon became more guarded, wary of every word and gesture. Frustration grew on both sides of the table. While suspicion gathered around Damon, the Hales and their supporters found themselves caught in a different kind of torment. They wanted to believe justice was close, that the person who took Rowan was within reach. But with every day that passed without an arrest, grief curdled into bitterness. The case dominated conversations at church suppers, school board meetings, and even in line at the grocery store. People speculated about Damon, about the green truck, about what Rowan might have done differently. The ache of uncertainty was relentless, eroding trust between neighbors who had once considered themselves close. Operation Lantern pressed forward, but the initial fire of the investigation had dimmed. Officers retraced their steps, revisited old statements, and pored over lists of names, hoping for a breakthrough. Some wondered if the answer lay outside Auburn, if the killer had simply vanished into the night, leaving the town to suffocate under the weight of suspicion. Caleb Hale haunted the police station nearly every day, his voice growing hoarser with each unanswered question. Marjorie stopped going to the grocery store altogether, unwilling to endure the sidelong glances and the relentless, well-meaning questions. Lydia and Rowan's friends, once inseparable, grew quieter, their laughter replaced with silence. By late spring, the case had stalled. Detectives found themselves circling the same frustrating ground. Damon Kincaid, the green pickup, the night Rowan Hale vanished. There was no confession, no evidence strong enough to arrest or indict. The file grew thicker, but the sense of resolution grew further away. In Auburn, hope took on a brittle edge. Rowan's portrait in the school hallway gathered dust, her promise of a future receding with every passing week. The memory of the alley, of the snow, the blood, and the sudden, senseless violence lingered in every household, refusing to fade. As the year wore on, some in the community whispered that justice might never come, and that Rowan's case would remain not just unsolved, but unfinished. The seasons changed, but for Auburn, time seemed to stall. Winter melted into a damp, uneasy spring, and the world moved forward with the mechanical persistence of small-town life. School bells ringing, mail delivered, lawns mowed and edges trimmed. But underneath, something essential was missing. The air was sharper, the streets quieter. The easy comfort of a shared past replaced by a nervous glance over the shoulder. Rowan's murder hung over the town like fog that would not lift. Children were no longer allowed to roam as freely as before. Parents who had once waved from their porches at dusk now stood in doorways, watching until their kids were safely inside. The shortcut through the alley was abandoned, weeds sprouting between patches of dried bloodstain, evidence tape still clinging to one fence post as a stark warning. Even broad daylight did little to banish the sense of unease that clung to Auburn. Neighborhood gatherings grew rare and subdued. Trust, once abundant, had become fragile and easily broken. Caleb and Marjorie Hale lived each day inside a vacuum of grief. Their world was measured by Rowan's absence, her empty chair at dinner, the unfinished painting propped on her easel, the unopened letters from colleges that had arrived months too late. Their home became a kind of shrine, full of silent memories and small, everyday heartbreaks. Sometimes, late at night, Marjorie would stand in Rowan's room, tracing her fingers over the ridges of brushstrokes on the canvas, imagining the life her daughter might have lived. It became a ritual for the Hales to visit the alley where Rowan died. Every week, no matter the weather, they lit a candle beneath the flickering street lamp, letting its thin light carve out a small circle of warmth in the cold. At first, neighbors joined them. Friends, teachers, classmates all gathered, heads bowed in silent vigil. But as the years slipped by, the crowd thinned until it was often just Caleb and Marjorie, two grieving figures surrounded by the hush of falling snow or the whisper of summer rain. They refused to let Rowan be forgotten. Each candle was a declaration. Their daughter's life still mattered. As the investigation faded from the headlines, the rhythm of police work shifted from urgent to routine. The case file, once thick with fresh reports and hopeful leads, now gathered dust in the evidence room. New officers cycled onto the force. Some read the details out of duty, others from morbid curiosity, but few believed they would be the one to solve it. For all the advancements in forensic science and investigative technique, Rowan's killer had left no trail behind. There were no fingerprints, no DNA matches, no missing weapon, just a haunting absence and a growing sense that whoever was responsible had vanished, untraceable. Years passed, first 5, then 10. Rowan's classmates graduated, left for college, found jobs in other towns or bigger cities, trying to build new lives, but always carrying the memory of what had happened. The story of Rowan Hale became part of Auburn's folklore, told in anxious whispers. Don't take the alley after dark. Stay where the lights are bright. People taught their children about the dangers lurking close to home, repeating the cautionary tale with a mixture of anger and helplessness. For Caleb and Marjorie, the world narrowed. Holidays were the hardest. The empty chair at Thanksgiving, the unopened gifts at Christmas, the quiet birthdays marked with flowers at the cemetery. Every year, on the anniversary of Rowan's death, they returned to the alley, standing shoulder to shoulder beneath the street lamp, eyes closed, hearts aching. Sometimes a stranger would pause to join them, lighting a candle, saying nothing. Sometimes Lydia would appear, older now, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers, her face set with the resolve of someone who could not let go of her best friend's memory. Despite everything, the Hales never lost hope, not entirely. They sent letters to the police chief every year, asking for updates, pleading for answers. Marjorie became a quiet advocate for victims' families, her grief transforming into a fierce desire to help others in similar pain. Caleb took to long walks at night, retracing Rowan's last steps, searching for anything at all that might have been missed. Auburn, for all its efforts to move on, remained a town marked by loss. Newcomers heard the story within weeks of arriving. Old-timers carried it like a burden they could never quite put down. The alley, once a shortcut, was now a scar, a reminder that safety could be shattered in an instant. As nearly 2 decades slipped by, the case was quietly labeled cold. Files stacked higher and higher, new mysteries crowding out the old. But for Rowan's parents, and for those who remembered her laughter, her art, her gentle presence, the truth was never forgotten. Their hope did not fade. It simply became quieter, woven into the fabric of every silent vigil and every candle flickering against the dark. By the winter of 2013, Auburn had changed in ways both visible and invisible. The town had grown, new housing developments and big box stores springing up at its edges. But the shadow of Rowan Hale's murder still lingered in the spaces between. Some remembered only in fragments, a name, a photograph, a cautionary tale for their children. But for the Hales, and for those who had never stopped caring, the wound had never healed, only scarred over. Nearly 20 years had passed. Marjorie's hair had gone gray at the temples, her eyes permanently tired. Caleb's shoulders slumped under the weight of years, yet every January they returned to the alley. Sometimes, a young officer would nod politely as they walked past the station, recognizing them by sight, if not by story. The couple kept their daughter's memory alive in the quiet, persistent way that only the bereaved can. One candle, one letter, one whispered plea for justice at a time. In the evidence room of the Auburn Police Department, the box labeled Hale, Rowan, 1996 had long since settled to the bottom of a filing cabinet. But 2013 was a year of changes. Across the country, old cases were stirring to life again, thanks to the revolution in forensic technology. New DNA extraction methods, more sensitive, more precise, were being tested in crime labs, making it possible to find genetic fingerprints where there had once been only silence. Auburn's cold case detective, a woman named Sandra Briggs, was assigned the backlog as part of a statewide initiative. She had not been on the force in 1996. She had no memories of the chaos or the sorrow, only the files, boxes stacked high with the echoes of lost lives. Rowan's case was not the oldest or the most notorious, but something in the photo of the quiet girl with the paint-smudged hands drew Sandra's attention. She read through the file late one evening, tracing the endless lists of statements, suspects, dead ends. There was the note about the green pickup, the composite sketches, the name Damon Kincaid underlined in red. There was the forensic report. Blood, no DNA match, evidence too degraded by cold and time. Sandra, dogged and methodical, wondered, what if there was something everyone had missed? She pulled the evidence bags from storage one by one. Rowan's jacket, sealed in plastic, still held the faintest ghost of her perfume, mixed now with the sterile tang of chemicals. Sandra sent it for retesting, not daring to hope, but refusing to dismiss even the smallest chance. Weeks passed. Crime labs were always busy, always behind. Life continued in Auburn. The anniversary of Rowan's death marked quietly with flowers and candles. Then, a call came that would change everything. The lab had found something, a blood stain, barely larger than a fingernail, hidden beneath the collar of Rowan's jacket. New technology made it possible to extract DNA from even the smallest, oldest samples. The result was clear, chilling in its certainty. The genetic profile matched a man in the system, a man serving time for a knife attack in another town. The name leapt out of the file like a curse. Damon Kincaid. Sandra sat for a long moment at her desk, letting the reality settle over her. 2 decades had passed. The evidence had been there, waiting, silent and stubborn. She called the state police, then the Hales, her voice steady as she delivered the news that Rowan's killer had finally been found. For Marjorie and Caleb, the world seemed to spin and then right itself after all these years. The pain was still there, but now, for the first time, there was hope, a promise that the truth might finally be spoken aloud. Word spread quickly through Auburn. Headlines once again featured Rowan's name. Break-in 1996 murder case, suspect identified through DNA. People who had nearly forgotten the details found themselves haunted by them all over again. Parents explained the story to children who had not been born when Rowan died. Lydia, now grown and living 2 towns over, wept when she heard, feeling the weight of old guilt and new relief. Detective Briggs and the prosecutor's office began preparing the case for trial. Damon Kincaid was transferred from his prison cell to face charges in Rowan's murder. The town braced itself for the coming storm, the reopening of wounds, the reliving of fear, and the long-awaited confrontation with a man who had eluded justice for so long. But beneath it all, a sense of relief began to ripple outward. For the first time in years, candles burned in the alley with a new purpose, not just remembrance, but gratitude. Rowan's friends and family gathered, holding each other, mourning again, but also daring to hope that the ache in their chests might finally ease. The truth, hidden for so long in blood and silence, had at last been brought into the light. The trial of Damon Kincaid opened in the spring of 2014, almost 18 years after Rowan Hale's life was stolen in the cold, silent alley of Auburn. For days beforehand, the town buzzed with anticipation and unease. Some doubted justice would ever come. Others braced themselves for the onslaught of headlines and television crews, the sudden intrusion of cameras and strangers onto streets that had long tried to forget. The courthouse itself became a crucible, thick with the gravity of years lost and hopes deferred. Journalists waited outside, notebooks in hand, as Rowan's parents slipped through the doors, heads bowed, hands clasped tightly together. For Marjorie and Caleb, the walk down the marble corridor felt impossibly long. Each step was a reminder of all that had been taken, the birthdays, the laughter, the quiet rituals of family life, interrupted by violence and then by silence. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy with the sense of reckoning. Damon Kincaid sat at the defense table, older now, his features hardened and grayer, but with the same implacable stare. He wore a prison-issue suit, hands shackled until the judge entered, his gaze flickering only occasionally to the rows of spectators, former teachers, neighbors, old classmates who had come to witness the ending of a story that had haunted them since adolescence. The prosecutor opened with the facts: the bloody alley, the silent, snowy night, the jacket sealed in evidence for nearly 2 decades. Exhibits projected on a screen showed grainy photos of the crime scene. Rowan's possessions laid out like artifacts from a lost world. A folded note, a sketchbook, a single mitten. The DNA results were described in careful, methodical detail, a line of science that cut through the haze of memory and rumor. The match was clear. The blood beneath the collar was Damon Kincaid's, as certain as if he'd signed his name across Rowan's coat. Testimony unfolded day by day. Forensic experts explained the advances in technology, the painstaking work that had brought the truth to light after so many years. Detectives, some now retired, spoke of their frustration, their determination, and the countless hours spent chasing dead ends. Friends of Rowan remembered her art, her laughter, the night she left for Lydia's house and never arrived. Lydia herself took the stand, her voice trembling as she described their plans for the future, her guilt for not insisting Rowan take the safer route. The defense tried to poke holes in the timeline, to raise doubts about memories blurred by time. They pointed to Damon's past, but argued there was no witness who saw the attack. No confession, just a thread of blood nearly 2 decades old. Yet the weight of the evidence pressed in on every person in the room. Through it all, the Hales sat quietly, fingers intertwined, their grief laid bare for everyone to see. There were days when Marjorie wept silently behind a tissue, and days when Caleb could do nothing but stare at the table, jaw clenched, willing himself to remain upright. Reporters watched for a flicker of anger or relief, but all they saw was exhaustion and a yearning for closure. The trial dragged on, the jury listening as the details of Damon's past emerged. Another knife attack, eerily similar, that had finally landed him in prison. The stories from that earlier case, fear, surprise, a victim who survived but would never forget, painted a chilling portrait of a man whose violence had always lurked just below the surface. The prosecution wove these facts together with Rowan's story, urging the jury not to be swayed by the passage of time. Justice, they argued, could be delayed but not denied. Weeks passed. The air in the courtroom grew thick with expectation. Every cough or shifting footfall a reminder of how much hung in the balance. Finally, after days of deliberation, the jury filed in, faces grave and drawn. The verdict was read with solemn clarity: guilty of first-degree murder. A gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by a hush as the sentence was announced: life in prison, with a minimum of 25 years before parole eligibility. Damon Kincaid sat expressionless, unmoved by the decision, as if the years had stripped him of even the ability to react. The judge's words echoed in the room. For Rowan, for her family, for Auburn itself, justice had finally been served. For Marjorie and Caleb, the verdict brought a wave of conflicting emotions: relief, gratitude, sorrow, and the quiet ache of all that could never be restored. As they left the courthouse, people gathered outside to offer quiet condolences and embraces. Lydia was there, tears streaming down her face, clutching Marjorie's hand as they stepped into the weak spring sunlight. In Auburn, word spread quickly. The case was over. Candles burned again in the alley, this time not just for memory, but for justice. People gathered in small groups, sharing stories of Rowan, daring at last to speak her name with something like hope. And as the day faded into evening, the promise made to her nearly 2 decades before, of answers, of truth, of peace had at last begun to be fulfilled. As the echoes of the verdict faded from the courthouse, Rowan Hale's story, though fiction, stood as a reflection of reality, a mirror held up to the tragedy that had unfolded across an ocean decades before. Her case, haunting Auburn for nearly 20 years, was built upon the real-life story of Claire Tiltman, a 16-year-old girl from Kent, England, whose name had once filled headlines and whose memory still lingered in the hearts of all who knew her. Claire's story began on a cold January night in 1993 in the town of Greenhithe. Like Rowan, Claire was a bright student, full of energy and kindness, with dreams that stretched beyond the edges of her small community. On the night she was murdered, she had set out to visit a friend, walking a familiar route that should have offered nothing but safety. She never arrived. The details were chilling in their similarity to Rowan's fictional fate. Claire took a shortcut down an alley, one she'd used countless times before. There, in the silent dark, she was attacked without warning. The assailant stabbed her 9 times, the violence swift and overwhelming, leaving her to bleed out alone as the world around her carried on, unaware of what had been lost. The crime shocked her town and soon drew national attention. In a country where random violence was rare, Claire's murder felt like a wound in the fabric of daily life. The initial investigation was massive. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people, tracked every possible lead, searched for a motive that made sense in a world where children were meant to be safe. Her family pleaded for information, their pain as public as it was profound. Yet, for all their efforts, the case seemed to slip through the cracks. No witnesses, no weapon, no clear suspect. Grief became a fixture in Greenhithe, just as it would later in Auburn, with flowers piling up in the alley and the simple question, "Why her?" echoing through homes and classrooms. Colin Ash Smith, a local milkman in his 20s, quickly drew suspicion. He was known to police for previous violent outbursts, especially with knives. There were rumors, whispers of past attacks, women who'd been lucky to escape, the sense that something dangerous lurked just beneath his calm exterior. Yet, just like with Damon Kincaid, the evidence was maddeningly thin. He was questioned, released, questioned again, but without direct proof, justice remained out of reach. Claire's family and community refused to let her case be forgotten. They pushed for answers, kept her memory alive at every anniversary, and never stopped hoping that someday the truth would emerge. The years crawled by. New detectives took up the file, reviewed old statements, re-examined the faded evidence. Still, the case remained cold, a scar on the town's history. It wasn't until 2013, 20 years after Claire's murder, that the tides finally began to turn. Forensic science had advanced, just as it would later in Rowan's fictional case. DNA testing, once in its infancy, now had the power to extract secrets from the smallest, oldest samples. Investigators sent a new round of evidence for analysis, hoping against hope for a breakthrough. This time, science delivered. A key piece of physical evidence, blood and fibers, pointed directly to Colin Ash Smith. He was brought to trial in 2014, the courtroom packed with those who remembered the day the world changed. The evidence was clear. His record of violence, his proximity to the alley, and the genetic proof found on Claire's belongings. After decades of grief and uncertainty, the jury convicted Ash Smith of Claire Tiltman's murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, the long-delayed justice finally catching up with him. For Claire's family, the verdict was bittersweet. No sentence, no words could bring her back. Yet the knowledge that her killer had been named, that her story had not faded into silence, offered a measure of peace. Her community, like Auburn in the fictional world, gathered to remember her life, lighting candles, telling stories, letting the memory of her kindness and hope outshine the darkness of her last moments. Rowan's story, in its sorrow and resolution, carried the essence of Claire's legacy, a testament to persistence, to the refusal of families and friends to let tragedy slip away unchallenged. It spoke to a deeper truth about the way justice sometimes moves. Painfully slow, shaped by heartbreak, delayed by the imperfections of law and science, but never wholly denied. For those who followed both stories, the connection was unmistakable. Two girls, worlds apart, whose names became symbols of what is lost and found when violence shatters the ordinary. Two families who refused to give up. Two towns forever changed. And above all, a reminder that in the face of darkness, the stubborn light of memory and justice can, eventually, prevail. Even as the last candles flickered out beneath the battered street lamp in the alleyway, the story of Rowan Hale refused to fade. The trial was over, the verdict rendered, and Damon Kincaid's name was now sealed in the record books as a murderer. The headlines thinned, reporters departed, and the courthouse returned to its quiet routines. But justice, when it finally arrives after years of waiting, never really feels complete. For the people of Auburn, and especially for the Hales, the aftermath was quieter, heavier, marked by the knowledge that something precious had been taken and could never be returned. In the weeks that followed the sentencing, Rowan's parents found themselves adrift. For years, their world had revolved around seeking answers, pushing the investigation forward, keeping their daughter's memory alive in the public eye. Now, with the truth finally spoken aloud, a strange emptiness settled in. The routines of grief gave way to a new, unfamiliar silence. Marjorie stood at the window in the evenings, her hands cupped around a cooling mug of tea, watching the street lamps blink on. Caleb took long walks through town, passing the mural painted in Rowan's memory at the high school, a swirl of blues and golds, echoing the light she brought into the world. Yet beneath the ache of loss, there was something else, a kind of peace, tentative and fragile, growing with each day that passed. The Hales found comfort in small things, in the cards and letters that continued to arrive from neighbors and strangers, in the sudden, unexpected laughter shared over an old memory, in the art club that Rowan's friends revived in her honor. The annual candlelight vigil became a tradition, not just for grief, but for hope. New faces joined the circle each year, hands clasped, heads bowed, their presence a quiet promise that Rowan's story would not be forgotten. Across town, the police station's cold case files, once a symbol of frustration and heartbreak, now bore the mark of something extraordinary. Detective Sandra Briggs, who had reignited the search for justice, made it a point to remind new officers of Rowan's case. She spoke of the advances in DNA technology, the breakthroughs that could happen even after decades of silence, and the duty to never give up, no matter how faint the hope. Rowan's photograph remained pinned to the bulletin board, a silent witness to the power of persistence and belief. The impact rippled outward. Parents in Auburn grew bolder in their advocacy, demanding safer streets, better lighting, more support for victims and their families. Schools launched self-defense workshops. Teachers offered extra time for students to talk. And the alley where Rowan had walked her final steps was eventually transformed into a small memorial garden, blooming each spring with wildflowers and bulbs planted by the community. What had once been a scar became, in time, a place of remembrance and quiet beauty. In moments of reflection, the townspeople understood that justice, even when delivered, did not erase pain or return what was lost. It did, however, bring clarity, a sense that the truth had been named, that the darkness no longer had the final word. Caleb and Marjorie spoke about Rowan at town events, sharing memories of her art and gentle spirit. Their voices steadier now, grief shaped by time into something like courage. They encouraged others, families still waiting for answers, parents fearful for their children, to hold on, to trust in the slow, sometimes invisible march of truth. And in the quiet hours, when the world seemed unchanged and ordinary, Rowan's story continued to resonate. People told it to their children, not as a warning, but as a testament to resilience, the belief that even after years of silence, hope could return. New students painted their own murals, wrote poems, left sketches at the garden gate. The town, once fractured by fear, now found unity in remembrance. Beyond Auburn, the story echoed farther still. The case of Claire Tiltman in England, so hauntingly similar, served as a reminder that families and communities everywhere could be bound together by tragedy, but also by the determination to seek justice. Advances in science, the tireless dedication of investigators, and the refusal to forget were threads that tied these stories together. Threads that, in their strength, could outlast decades of darkness. As the final anniversary approached, the garden glowed with candlelight. Old friends embraced, new faces joined the vigil, and the Hales stood at the center, their hearts heavy but full. Marjorie whispered Rowan's name into the spring air. Caleb closed his eyes, imagining his daughter's laughter drifting on the breeze. In the end, cold cases remind us that justice may be delayed, but it is never truly forgotten. Rowan Hale and Claire Tiltman, both taken far too young, became more than victims. They became symbols of perseverance, of love that refused to yield, of the simple, profound truth that the stories we remember have the power to change the world. Cold cases may sleep for decades, but the truth never dies. Don't forget to subscribe and follow for more untold stories.